As part of a series of programs organized by Rajya Sabha Television on this occasion, I will be in conversation with women writers and literary figures, and we will be talking about how women writing in India has helped or influenced in women empowerment and creating an awareness. We are coming to you from the Hungarian Institute and Cultural Center, and we also have with us students from NDTV School of Journalism. On the panel today, from my left, is Dr. Anjana Srivastava. She is an associate professor at Kamla Nehru College. We have Jayashree Mishra, best-selling author of 7 novels. We also have Ritu Menon, who is from Women Unlimited. She is the co-founder of Kali for Women, the first Indian feminist press. Finally, on our panel, there's also Annie Zaidi, who is a journalist and a bilingual author. Welcome, all of you, to In Another Tongue. Well, I'd like to begin with you, Rituji. When we look at feminism on the international level, we have Elaine Showalter, who speaks about how feminism can be categorized into phases. She speaks about the feminine phase, where women wrote in imitation of man, the feminist phase, where she wrote against male domination, and then finally you have the female phase, where she writes more comfortably about her own sexuality, gender issues, etc. When you look at feminism or women writing in India, will these classifications work, or are we talking about a completely different way of writing?
Well, I think in India it's a little more difficult to have this kind of periodization because, as we know, women have been writing from the 6th century BC, all kinds of tracts and texts and poetry and plays. So whether or not to call it pre-feminist, feminist, or now what is called female or post-feminist, I think this is something that probably has to do much more with the Western academia than it does have to do with us here, which is not to deny that there isn't a feminist sensibility or a feminist politics. And I'd say that in India, that's been fairly prominent from, let's say, the late 70s onwards. Really, from when the women's movement began to make available research and writing on the status of women in India. But I'd say by and large, we could perhaps classify it as maybe feminist and womanist, which is a word that Alice Walker uses, not Elaine Showalter so much. And what she means by womanist is something that is, I guess, over and above all these.
As somebody who is teaching this at a college level, how would you classify Indian women writing?
I think I would rather go along with what Ritu ended with. That is to look at them as two categories, one which writes in languages other than English, and another which writes in a more global context, that is in English. In terms of writing in other languages, there has been a lot of feminist consciousness raising within certain language traditions, and we can go back to Chandrabati, we can look at Mahadevi Akka, and it is a metro experience which now gets more and more incorporated into Indian writing in English.
Right. So that was a question that I had for Annie, really. Modern Indian women writers, or modern Indian writing as such, writes about a society that is that is set in a modern day India, which is not very rooted in a pan-Indian culture per se, that the writings are very metrocentric. How would you as a writer maybe comment on something like that?
Writers write about their own environments to begin with. I mean, that is primary. I will write about what I know. So yes, it is urban, but that is because that is where a lot of the Indian writing in English is coming from. And I don't think literature works if you seek to go out and address something. That is not how it works.
And would you like to comment on that? Because you've actually dealt with both these genres per se, your first book being very particular, very specific to a particular cause, and then the later books kind of took a different turn. So would you like to comment maybe on?
I completely agree with what Annie says about novelists setting out with some kind of agenda. I don't think it works, and I think it's probably the best way to put readers off your books if they feel that you're out there sort of campaigning or proselytizing on behalf of some cause. So the important thing to a novelist is to tell a story and tell it as well as they possibly can. The experience, I think that the fact that Ritu touched upon this, is that people have been writing, women have been writing in all the different regional languages and going back a very, very long time. If we're discussing specifically Indian writers in English, I think I would agree that maybe the experience that is being narrated, that is being disseminated, is that of the urban experience largely. But I don't necessarily have a problem with that. Those are valid stories as well. And in many of those stories lies enormous universality of experience. And this is what I find when I get feedback. And thanks to email, I get feedback from all over. And it amazes me, still amazes me when I get someone from a small town in England perhaps writing to me saying, I so completely identified with the experiences of the protagonist of a novel of mine that's been set in Kerala, for instance. So there obviously is that universality without even trying to do it. It's there. That's the human experience.
We were talking about how writers need to be universal in the way they approach, and they should not have an agenda. They should not go ahead with an agenda per se. We will come back to you with more on this after a break. Welcome back. We're in conversation with women writers and literary figures. I'll take it back to you, Ritu. In the 50s, 60s, there was more of a nationalistic movement, and then in the 80s, there was more a social awakening. But what do you see the state of women writing today in India?
Well, I mean, if we are speaking of women writing in all languages, then I think, I would be reluctant to separate it into this decadal kind of shift. Yes, certain kinds of writing are more common at certain periods, but that has to do with lots of other things that are happening within the country, let's say. And women obviously respond to what's happening. What I think is very interesting that's happened, and that maybe is something that's a phenomenon of now, is that there is a blurring of boundaries between genres. So the novel is not the novel in the form that we generally think of it. There's a prose poem, for example. There's a paragraph short story, which is not something that we are familiar with either. There are many kinds of genres which are now perfectly permissible and perfectly acceptable and very, very inventive. So in that sense, I'd say that to me is the interesting new development.
If we look at English in colleges, the English that you teach in colleges these days, like she was saying, there's a lot of writing coming from other parts of India, and it's not necessarily one English that we're talking about now. We're talking about a collective English. There are many Englishes per se, and suddenly the voices that were once silenced are now being projected in our classrooms. The syllabus includes all of that. So how does that work for a teacher when you look at the curriculum and incorporating such elements?
Well, actually, Delhi University changed its curriculum in 2000. And what it did was to shift the boundaries of English literature and incorporate literature in translation from other Indian languages. What has also happened is that the Delhi University curriculum has increasingly incorporated a lot of feminist voices in various disciplines, and that has included literature. We have an optional paper which is titled Women's Writing. That itself gives you an idea of the feminist politics, which is the orientation of the paper itself. So there has been a shifting of boundaries of the discipline, of the languages, of the politics of the discipline, and I think that is what is very exciting about literature at the moment in the classroom.
While we are in the conversation of what's happening in the classroom, maybe I'll put it across to the students here. Would you like to question them about any of the ideology that they've been discussing so far?
When we talk about writing in English and writing in other languages, and you have come across novels of other languages also, what are the difference that you see? Is there any kind of differences in feminist writing?
I get publishers telling me all the time, or agents even, that it's the quality of the writing that counts. It's the quality of the story. That's what they're looking for. They're not necessarily, when a manuscript lands up on the desk of an agent or a publisher, they're reading it sometimes without any knowledge, and they'd rather not have the knowledge of whether it's a translated work or whether it's come originally from another language or whether it's been written by somebody sitting in a far corner. What will first reach out to them is the quality of the language they see in front of them, and then the story as they progress through the manuscript. So everything else kind of becomes relevant only somewhere along the way, especially when the production's taking place and they're thinking in terms of marketing the book. then that's when all these other questions become relevant about which language it was written in, the other people who do the
I
marketing.
would also like to make the distinction between women writing and feminist writing. It's not the same thing, nowhere near the same thing. There is feminist writing which can come from anywhere in the world and from all languages in India, and it can come from men. But a lot of women's writing in any language is not what I would consider feminist, but then my feminism is different from your feminism and different from Ritu's feminism. So there are all these different forces at play, and it's very difficult to make a distinction to kind of define a certain text as feminist or non-feminist, and in which language and in which form and how feminist and so on.
But there's one thing I'd like to add. It's a very interesting observation that one of the writers made. Women, all women, feminist, non-feminist, womanist, female, whatever, whichever one you want to use, find it very difficult to write about sex, not sexuality, sex. And one of the writers said, I just cannot do it in Hindi. I don't have the vocabulary for it in Hindi. And another said, who writes in English, that she had no problem at all, because the language itself offered that possibility and that facility without it becoming, without it being trivialized or made into some kind of, semi-pornographic writing. And that kind of limitation, I think there has to be, one has to think about at least. So
Could that also be that there's an existing body of work?
Of course.
And in English, it's
Yes,
less
of
unusual
course.
to have a sex scene.
I mean, I don't know if male writers have this problem. I've never talked to them about it. But from whatever I've seen, at any rate, of what is called so-called erotic literature that is coming out now, it's in English. There's very little that has appeared in translation that we can, compare it with.
Well, we were talking on a really interesting topic at the moment, and I'd like to hear more about this, but we have to take a quick break right here. Welcome back. We have a question here, yes?
A majority of the women's writing which comes from, let's say, the rural areas of India, what topics do they cover? Is it more about politics, romance, or just entertainment?
Well, I don't know whether I can make general comments about what women write about, but what would go under the category of women's writing, which is largely feminist writing for me, the way we define it, I would say that valid experiences of women. How distinct it is from that of men. And I think that is the most exciting thing about women's writing, that it opens up languages in which women can articulate their experiences. The fact that women writers are working around these very ideas, thinking about them and thinking about how to articulate those experiences, that is what connects women's writing with women's experiences and the women's movement then.
There's a Tamil writer by the name of Bama. I don't know if you've heard the name. She's a Dalit writer. She lives in what is a sort of semi-urban, in a tiny town in Tamil Nadu. She's a teacher. She teaches in a school. And she writes about the reality of Dalit life. In her writing, you will find she observes no literary conventions. She uses abusive language. She simply has no time for the short story form, the novel form, the autobiographical form, the diary form. She uses each of these in the way she wants. But she writes what she wants to communicate to her reader. She has a very, very clear purpose in her writing, and she has said it. She said, I'm not writing because I'm a writer. I'm writing because I have something to say, and I'm going to say it.
I personally met Bama Faustina once. She's a teacher, like she mentioned. In class, when she would bring this topic of the Dalit caste issue in class, she would have parents who went back to her to tell her that, you're a teacher, you teach what is there in the syllabus and don't talk over and beyond that, because Chennai is a very conservative, Brahminical society at many levels. So that is just an added point to the fact that what she mentioned. But when you look at writing like that, say Bama for instance, she is branded as a Dalit woman writer. Generally we look at things in in that closed circuit particular sort of form. And then you kind of have a specific set of readers for them. If you market a person as a Dalit writer, then you have an intellectual sort of audience who wants to read her, but then others don't.
Specifically, Bama is translated into French, into German, into Italian, so obviously she's reaching a fairly wide readership. And in her case, I know that she insists on being called a Dalit writer because it's a badge of resistance. Of resistance. It's not stereotyping in her case, but a declaration that she wants to make of her politics.
I do disagree that adopting a certain identity consciously, if it's thrust upon you, it's different. But if you adopt it consciously, then I don't think that it necessarily limits you. In fact, if that is what your writing is about primarily, and you seek to make it that way, then I think that that can also be a way of actually finding new audiences.
It can also be a straitjacket though. I was on a panel with Meena Kandaswamy quite recently. And she consciously wears that badge of Dalit woman writer because she feels, it's exactly as you said, it's a badge of resistance. But she says equally, of late, she started getting letters. Whenever she writes anything else, anything outside of that specific Dalit experience, she gets angry letters from other people from the Dalit community who say, well, it's your job to go out there and talk about issues that pertain to the Dalit community. So it can work both ways, I think.
American writer Naomi Wolf has mentioned that the age of victim feminism is in the past. By this she means when a woman uses her female specialness to apply or to ask for special statuses in society. Now, would you say that in India we are past that stage, or we will ever come to a situation where we will be past such a stage?
I think women have got out of the victimhood syndrome. I mean, if you look at the 1 billion rising movement, you look at the number of people, at least in Delhi, it seems like we have moved away from the sense of being a victim and rather assuming agency. And I think social media, at least in the metros, has been responsible for that.
I think that, when we sort of reference something that's happening here with either Elaine Showalter or Naomi Wolf or Simone de Beauvoir or anyone else, who are iconic figures and, they seem to speak for everyone's truth. But the fact is that there are very many realities even here. And of course, we have had 1 billion rising and a huge, huge outrage around the December 16th rape. But we can't deny the fact that the majority of women still experience horrendous violence. They still live lives of extreme deprivation. So, there is another slogan that perhaps one could say in response to Naomi Wolf, which is, we'll be post-feminist in post-patriarchy. But as long as patriarchy is alive and well and being strengthened, I don't think we should be either victims or only survivors, because we are both at the same time, probably in the same person.
So that's a fabulous summing up for our session today. Thank you very much for joining us on the dais, all of you, and thank you for coming. Thank you, really.